At least one of my daughters has the sense to make something of herself. My mother said it while pouring herself a glass of Pinot Grigio, not looking at me, not even pretending this was accidental. She was looking at my sister, who was perched on the kitchen stool in her Lululemon set, laughing at something on her phone. 14 people heard it. My aunt and uncle from Kelowna, 3 cousins, my mother's book club friends, my sister's fiancé, and the neighbors from next door who'd been coming to every family dinner since before I could remember. 14 people, and not one of them said a word. My mother set the bottle down on the granite counter and smiled at me. 41 years old, no home of your own, still renting in the city while the rest of us have built something real. Her voice had that particular softness she used when she wanted an insult to land clean, the tone of someone who believed they were just being honest. She tilted her head at my sister. Kira knows what stability looks like. Maybe that will sink in eventually. 14 people laughed, not nervously. The full permission-granted kind that only happens when the person at the center of the room fires first and everyone else falls in line, because it's safer to laugh with her than to be the one who doesn't. I didn't look away. I looked straight into my mother's eyes, past the reading glasses pushed up on her head, past the Chardonnay flush, past 41 years of her deciding I was the version of her children she'd rather not explain to people. And I set my glass down on the counter, without a sound. One word. Ridgecrest. The room went cold in a way I hadn't expected. From the back of the open-plan living room, near the bookshelf my mother had arranged to look like she read more than she did, my father's old friend from his RCMP days had gone completely still. He was 67 years old, retired Chief Superintendent, the kind of man who had spent 3 decades walking into rooms where things had already gone wrong. He was holding a cracker he'd picked up from the cheese board, and he did not bring it to his mouth. He put it back down on the plate without eating it. His voice came out low and careful, the way you speak when you're certain you've just heard something you didn't expect to hear in a kitchen in Oakville, Ontario. Ridgecrest, he repeated. That's what they called her at Ridgecrest? He turned to my mother. No softness in his expression, no deference to the host. Elaine, do you know what your daughter did at Ridgecrest? The laughter died where it stood. But before I tell you why a man who had spent 30 years inside the worst rooms in this country went quiet at the sound of that word, and who paid for that dinner party in ways my mother is still calculating, give this video a like and subscribe to this channel. Because what happened next, nobody in that kitchen was prepared for. His name was Douglas Rath. He had known my father for 26 years before my father died, and he'd kept showing up at my mother's house after, because that's the kind of man he was. He pulled out his wallet, not for money. He kept a photograph in there, folded once, the kind of photograph that had been opened and refolded so many times the crease had gone soft. He unfolded it on the kitchen island between the cheese board and the Pinot Grigio, and smoothed it flat with one hand. It was a newspaper photograph, the Globe and Mail, from 4 years ago, no name in the caption. The subject's face partially turned from the camera, but the headline above it was clear enough. He tapped the photograph once with his index finger and said, very quietly, to the room. This woman walked into a situation that 3 trained officers had already walked out of. She didn't have authorization, didn't have backup, didn't have anything except the judgment she'd spent 15 years building. And she brought 2 kids home alive. Nobody moved. 14 people in my mother's kitchen in Oakville on a Saturday night in November, knowing less about the woman who'd been coming to this house for 41 years than a retired police officer who kept a folded newspaper photograph in his wallet. I said nothing. Lifted my wine glass, set it back down, in the exact ring it had already left on the counter. No sound. I wasn't watching Doug. I was scanning the room out of habit. 14 people. Who was looking for an exit? Who was waiting for me to get emotional so they could call me dramatic? Who was watching my mother for instructions on how to react? My cousin Tessa was looking at her boyfriend's shoulder. My Uncle Ray had found something very interesting in the bottom of his beer glass. My sister Kira had lowered her phone for the first time in 2 hours, but her thumb was still poised over the screen like she wanted to be ready to look back down again the moment this became uncomfortable. My mother recovered the way she always recovered, fast. Her voice dropped into the patient register she used when she was explaining something she considered obvious to someone she considered slow. Doug, I appreciate you saying that. I truly do. But Maeve has always had a way of making her work sound more significant than it was. Even as a child, she lived in her own world. We all love her very much. A ripple of relieved laughter moved through the room, tension released. Kira added her line with surgical timing, brow furrowed in manufactured concern, phone now face down on the counter like she'd set it aside out of genuine care. Are you okay? You seem tired. You've seemed really tired lately. The question was engineered down to the syllable. Not a hero, a patient. Someone who needed to be checked on, not saluted. I set my glass down, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. I walked to Doug, shook his hand. Short, firm, eyes level. Thank you for coming, Chief Superintendent. Just enough for anyone paying attention to catch that I knew his exact rank. He leaned in slightly, voice below the kitchen noise. I'm having lunch tomorrow with a reporter from the Star, David Chen. He's been trying to get the family's permission to run the full story for 2 years. The family said yes last month. One beat. I nodded once. I didn't go back inside after dinner. I sat in my car in front of my mother's house with the engine off and both hands on the steering wheel, the way I used to sit before briefings, before site visits, before any moment that required me to be exactly as steady as I was pretending to be. When I reached over to get my jacket from the passenger seat, my hand caught the edge of something my mother had slid into my bag at some point during the evening. A magazine. Canadian Living, a back issue from 2 years ago, folded open to a home decor spread. My sister's dining room was on page 43. 5 pages on how Kira had renovated her heritage home in Hamilton. My mother had underlined a quote from the article, "Family is what you build, not just where you come from." I closed the magazine, put it in the glove compartment, not because it didn't sting, because I had learned a long time ago that the things that sting are evidence, and evidence needs to be stored properly. The memories don't come in sequence, they come in pieces. The year I got my social work designation, my mother didn't ask about the ceremony, didn't ask when it was, didn't tell anyone. 3 weeks later, when Kira was promoted to regional manager at her financial firm, my mother booked a dinner at Buka in Toronto, reserved 2 weeks in advance, and sent individual texts to 11 family members with the time and parking information. The year I completed my crisis negotiation certification, my mother said, at Thanksgiving, "Maeve does something with social work. It's very admirable," to a room full of people who had known me my entire life. The year I mailed her a copy of a commendation letter from the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies, she used it as a coaster for a plant on her windowsill. I saw it when I visited in March, waterlogged at the edges, the letterhead gone brown. Not one accident, not one isolated moment of distraction. A system. Maintained with the kind of precision that only exists when someone has been practicing it for decades. Kira was seen. Maeve was tolerated. The sharpest memory is the one I've turned over the most. I was 19, sitting at the kitchen table telling my mother I'd been accepted into the social work program at Ryerson. She didn't get angry, she got gentle. The tone of someone delivering a diagnosis they found very unfortunate. "Oh, Maeve, that's for people who don't know what else to do with themselves." Kira was at the counter making a sandwich and didn't look up. She never needed to say anything. My mother held the blade. Kira just kept the kitchen clean. That was the first time I understood with the kind of clarity you can't unlearn that my mother hadn't decided to doubt me. She had decided, before I was old enough to prove anything either way, that this particular child had arrived with a lower ceiling. And she had never once revised that assessment in the 22 years since. I put my mother's magazine back in her mailbox on the way out and drove home to Toronto. I remembered something my supervisor at the agency had told me in my second year, when I was burning out and considering quitting. The work doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Every file, every family, every door you knock on, that someone answers because you knocked. That's the record. And the record doesn't need you to defend it. 15 years I had lived inside that sentence. But this time, after that word had left my mouth in my mother's kitchen and Doug had said what he said about the reporter, something had shifted. Not inside me, around me. This time, the truth was not going to stay in a filing cabinet in a government building on University Avenue. Ridgecrest didn't need me to remember it. It was always there, in the corner of every quiet room I'd sat in since December 4 years ago, 11 p.m. on a Thursday. A call came into the agency's after-hours line, a building in the East End of Toronto. 2 children, ages 4 and 7, alone in a third-floor apartment. Father had been taken to hospital. The building's super had called it in. CS dispatched a worker. The worker arrived, found the situation escalating. Building had a structural issue on the stairwell. The main access was compromised. Residents on upper floors couldn't get out through the usual route. Fire had been called. Police had been called. The children were behind a locked interior door, and the younger one, from what anyone could hear, was in acute distress. 2 officers had assessed and stepped back. Building wasn't safe. Protocol was to wait. I wasn't on shift. I'd come in to pick up files I'd left on my desk. I heard the call from the break room. My coworker Smita was standing in the doorway to the main office when I came out of the break room with my jacket on. She looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. She said, "You don't have authorization for this." I said no. She held my eyes for another second, then stepped out of the doorway. That's what trust looks like when the rulebook has been set aside, and what's left is whether the person across from you will bring it home. The stairwell was worse than the radio had described. 3rd floor, I counted every step. The 4-year-old's name was Lucas. He was standing on the other side of the door when I got it open, holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear, not crying anymore, just waiting the way very small children wait when they have been afraid for long enough that being afraid has become the default weather. His sister Amara was behind him. 7 years old, hand on her brother's shoulder, eyes on the door I'd just come through. I said, "I'm here. We're going to go now." Amara said, "Are you the person who was supposed to come?" I said yes, that was the only lie I told that night. I carried Lucas. Amara held my hand on the stairs. We were on the second-floor landing when the ceiling above the third-floor corridor shifted. The sound it made wasn't loud. It was the sound of something that had been holding on finally letting go. We were already on the main floor when the stairwell access collapsed. Coming home didn't mean safe. It never does. An internal review was opened within a week. I had entered a compromised structure without authorization. I had taken 2 children into active risk. The fact that the alternative was 2 children alone in a building where the exits were closing didn't factor into the initial language of the review. The language of the initial review was reckless disregard for protocol, endangerment of minors in CAS care, failure to follow assessed risk parameters. Everything worded to make it sound as though I was the variable that had created the danger, rather than the person who had calculated it and walked in anyway. The agency's communications office had already spoken to 2 journalists before I'd even had my first review meeting. The story that ran in 2 outlets was carefully shaped. Worker enters unsafe structure against direct instruction, creates additional liability for agency. Children were never in immediate danger per on-site assessment. Nobody printed the part where Lucas was still holding his rabbit when I carried him out. Nobody asked Amara what she'd seen from behind her brother on those stairs. I called home, the only time in my adult life that I cried on the phone to my mother, not as a senior practitioner or a designated crisis worker. As a daughter sitting at her kitchen table in a Toronto apartment at midnight with her hands shaking, asking the woman who raised her to say 3 words, "I believe you." She listened to everything: the building, the stairwell, the children, the review, the way the story had been shaped before I'd had a chance to say anything. She listened without interrupting, and for one fragile moment I thought, maybe this is the thing. Maybe hearing your child's voice break is the thing that finally cracks through. She waited until I'd finished. Then she said, voice flat, almost tired, "I told you social work wasn't stable," and she hung up. I held the phone against my ear. The clock on my microwave read 12:14. I watched it change to 12:15 before I understood that she was simply gone, that she had always been gone, that I had been calling a number that didn't connect to the person I was looking for. 2 days later, my then-partner texted me, not to ask if I was okay, not to say he'd read the coverage and knew it was wrong. He wanted to know if I was planning to fight the review or take the reprimand quietly, because it was affecting his ability to refer clients to my agency and he needed to know how to manage it. He didn't use the word "we" once in the entire text. The home front collapses faster than a stairwell and with less warning. My supervisor, Constance, was the one who held the line, not with comfort, with action. A quiet internal transfer to a role that moved me out of frontline crisis work while the review ran its course. A record so clean it gave the review nothing to hold on to. She shielded me from the agency's political machinery and gave me something nobody else had offered: a reason to stay in the work instead of walking out. "You don't need to be vindicated today," she told me in her office, door closed, voice steady. "You need to still be here when the vindication arrives. And it will arrive. It always does for people who were actually right." She paused. "The children know what happened on those stairs. That's not nothing. Don't let them turn it into nothing." I opened my eyes in the car in front of my mother's house in Oakville. 4 years had passed since Ridgecrest. 48 months. And my mother had not once, in a phone call, in a text, at Easter, at Thanksgiving, at Christmas, asked how I had come through any of it. Not the review, not the coverage, not the months of watching my name used as a shorthand for recklessness in a profession I had given 15 years of my life to. Not the nights when staying in the work was a decision I had to remake every single morning, like signing a contract with myself from scratch. But Doug kept the photograph. Constance kept her word. And somewhere in a house in Scarborough, a 9-year-old named Amara was probably doing her homework right now, which she could do because she had made it off those stairs. The dinner party scattered the way those things do, cars pulling out of the driveway in quick succession, people grateful for reasons to leave that didn't require them to have said anything. My mother went inside without looking at me. My aunt squeezed my hand on the way to her car, said nothing, which was actually the most honest thing anyone had managed all evening. I was unlocking my car when Doug followed me to the driveway. Didn't ask. Just fell into step the way certain people do when they've spent enough time in situations where checking in first is a luxury. He stopped at a distance that didn't press. "I want you to know one thing," he said. He unfolded the photograph again and held it out. The day this ran, I was sitting in my kitchen in Burlington finishing my coffee. I didn't know it was you at first. I cut it out because the headline was the kind I kept. And then I looked at the photograph more carefully. He paused. "I've known you since you were 11 years old. I recognize the way you hold your shoulders." I looked down at the photograph. The caption beneath it described a crisis worker who had entered a compromised structure on Gerrard Street East and facilitated the safe evacuation of 2 children in the moments before a stairwell collapse. No name. Agency communications had made sure of that. But the details were there if you knew what you were reading. It took me 3 full seconds before I could look up. This was the first time in 4 years that someone had paid attention and kept the record. Not because they owed me, not out of professional obligation, because they chose to. Why did you keep it? I asked. Investigator's voice, not gratitude. Doug folded the photograph carefully and held it out to me. Because I was at your father's funeral, he said, and I watched you hold your mother up for 3 hours when you were barely holding yourself. And I thought, that woman is going to spend her life carrying things nobody will ever see her carry. The least I can do is notice. Something tightened behind my sternum, not sadness, not satisfaction, recognition. While my mother was telling her book club I'd made a poor career choice. While my partner was calculating the liability. While an agency communications team was managing the narrative. A man I hadn't seen in 2 years had been sitting in his kitchen in Burlington, recognizing the way I hold my shoulders in a newspaper photograph. He pressed the photograph into my hand. David Chen at the Star. He's been sitting on the full story because the families weren't ready. They're ready now. Both families. Lucas's father called him himself. He looked at me steadily. This belongs to you now. The record has always belonged to you. I sat in my car and placed the photograph on the passenger seat and looked at it for a long moment. Then I reached for my phone. Constance answered on the second ring, the way she always answered, as though she had been half expecting the call. The Ridgecrest file, I said. I've had the internal records ready for 6 months, she said, waiting for you. I was reaching for the door handle to go back inside and get my jacket, which I'd left on the chair by the door, when my mother appeared around the side of the house, moving faster than I expected. She was carrying a plate of the butter tarts she made every year for Kira's birthday, wrapped in cellophane, held out toward me like a peace offering she'd already decided had been accepted. You didn't eat much at dinner. Her voice had changed entirely. Razored edges filed smooth. Take these. You work too hard to not eat properly. I looked at the plate. Butter tarts, the exact recipe she baked for Kira's birthday every December without variation. In 31 years, she had never made them for mine. I'm all right, I said. Voice level as a floor. She didn't leave. Couldn't. Leaving would mean accepting that butter tarts hadn't fixed it. Doug means well, she said, sliding into the patient instructional tone, the one she used when correcting someone who didn't have her experience. But he's retired for 5 years. He's not current on how these things work. I'm not saying you didn't do something, I'm saying he's gotten a bit, dramatic about it. Gaslighting, delivered by a woman who had never once set foot in a crisis intake building. I watched her face the way I'd been trained to watch faces, jaw slightly tight, eyes moving to the neighbor's lit window every few seconds, checking who might still be visible. This wasn't a private conversation between a mother and a daughter. This was damage control staged for the remnants of an audience. Kira appeared from behind her, appearing by accident, phone in hand but eyes not on the screen. Hey, are you sure you're okay? Like, truly? We worry about you. You always seem like you're carrying something. You don't have to carry everything alone. She paused. Her eyes went just wet enough to function as emotion without requiring her to actually cry. I don't always understand your work, but I want to. The structure of it was immaculate. Reposition me from someone who warranted a retired chief superintendent going quiet in a kitchen to someone who needed her family to worry about her. Not a record, a burden, not recognized. Managed. I looked at my sister for the first time that evening without any performance behind my eyes. Chin up 1 degree. Just enough for her to read that I had followed every line of the script she was running. Mum, Kira. I placed my hand flat on the car door, voice low and even. I'm not going to argue tonight, not because I don't have anything to say. Because what I need to say isn't meant for a driveway in November. My mother opened her mouth. Doug doesn't exaggerate, I said, before she could shape the first syllable, and I'm not carrying anything I didn't choose to pick up. But that conversation isn't for tonight. I got in the car. Started the engine. Did not check the rearview mirror. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. David Chen. Tomorrow. The families had already said yes. 1 in the morning. My kitchen table. The small light over the stove, which I'd never bothered replacing with anything better because it was enough. My journal opened to a page I'd written in my second year of practice, when I was 25 and starting to understand what this work was actually going to cost. I'd written, "You will not always be believed. Do it anyway." I didn't need to read it. I knew every word. But tonight I needed to see it with my eyes, not just carry it in memory. Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? It wasn't a verse I'd turned to in the way some people turn to scripture. It was more like a frequency I'd discovered existed, somewhere in the years of knocking on doors that needed someone to knock. Tonight it carried a different weight. Not about a stairwell in the East End, About a banquet hall, somewhere in this city where people who had written the language of that internal review were still writing their own record, unchallenged. I walked to my closet and took out the thing I wore when the work required me to be legible to people who otherwise wouldn't know how to read me. My dress uniform from the provincial recognition ceremony 2 years ago, navy blazer with the Ontario Association commendation pin, the citation from the Lieutenant Governor's office, the certificate from Constance's agency director framed, which usually sat in a box because I didn't have wall space, but which I unfolded now and placed on the table. Each piece was a chapter in a life my mother had never opened, each one pressed and sharp and entirely without apology. My phone buzzed. Constance. I picked up on the first ring. The internal review summary, she said, marked confidential for 4 years. The agency's own assessment noted that the outcome, 2 children evacuated prior to structural failure, was directly attributable to the unauthorized entry. A pause. They buried it. I have a certified copy. I closed my eyes. 4 years. That document had existed for 4 years while my professional record carried a reprimand, and 2 journalists had been allowed to frame the story as recklessness. Will you be there? I asked. Constance was quiet for 1 beat. I've had it in my bag for 3 days waiting for you to call. I set the phone down. Looked at the citation on the table, the commendation pin, the journal open to I'd written at 25, changed into sleep clothes, lay down, 4 hours, same as before anything that mattered. 5 a.m. standing in front of the bathroom mirror without performing anything for it. The face looking back was not younger and not softer after 15 years of doorsteps and midnight phone calls and internal reviews and conversations that nobody saw except the people in the room. But it was clearer than it had ever been about what it owed. I thought about my mother's words in the kitchen. Still renting in the city, no home of your own. I looked into my own eyes, no anger, no particular sadness. The stillness of someone who had been standing in exactly this moment their entire career and had learned not to confuse it with anything it wasn't. I put the commendation pin on the lapel of my blazer. Ridgecrest was ready. If you've ever given years of yourself to something that mattered, and the people who should have seen it looked right through you, give this video a like so I know this is reaching you. And if you have a moment like this one, leave it in the comments. Sometimes saying it where someone can hear it is enough to make it lighter. The atrium of the Metro Toronto Convention Centre. December afternoon light coming through the glass ceiling in long pale panels across the marble floor. The Ontario Child Welfare Recognition Gala. Dark suits, lanyards on silk ribbons. The particular smell of an event where people have gathered to feel good about something they've decided matters. Constance to my left. Doug 2 steps behind, because he had insisted on coming and I hadn't argued. I wore the blazer with the pin, not for ceremony. Because this room spoke a language I was fluent in, and I intended to be perfectly legible. A woman with a clipboard and a headset stopped us at the registration table. I don't see your name on the confirmed guest list. I looked at her, no expression. I'm here as a record. She looked at Constance. Constance looked at her. The woman with the clipboard recalculated and stepped back. From across the atrium, I saw him. Dennis Hargreaves, the agency's deputy director at the time of the Ridgecrest review. Silver-haired, comfortable, the ease of a man who had spent long enough being right about things in rooms like this one, that he'd stopped distinguishing between being right and being senior. He was holding a champagne flute and speaking to someone from the ministry. He saw the blazer first, then the pin, then he did the calculation that people who have been in long enough always do when they see that combination. 15 years of unbroken practice, an award citation from the Lieutenant Governor's office, a provincial recognition commendation, each one expensive in its own way. Then he found the face behind the pin. The face he had last seen sitting across the table from HR, maintaining a composure he had taken for submission. I held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then I walked to a table near the center of the room and sat down with both hands flat on the surface, the way I had sat in every review, every intake assessment, every room where someone needed me to be steady. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. My phone buzzed. Constance, from 2 seats away, had texted, "Front row confirmed, everything is set." I turned the phone face down. I had been waiting 4 years. A few more minutes was rounding error. Hargreaves came to my table before the program began. He had to. Leaving me sitting there without attempting to manage it would have been a worse calculation than the approach. He extended his hand, palm open, smile deployed like a policy. "Maeve, you look well. I didn't know you'd be here tonight." I looked at his hand. Let the silence hold for 4 full seconds. Well enough to remember the language of the internal summary that was marked confidential, I said. My voice didn't rise. The one where the outcome was attributed to the unauthorized entry. He lowered his hand. The smile didn't come back. He turned and walked back toward the ministry table, but I watched his shoulders ride up around his ears and stay there, the posture of a man who had just understood that the room had changed. Doug settled into the chair beside me. "Your mother and your sister," he said very quietly. "East entrance." They've been here for 10 minutes. I didn't turn my head. I'd seen them the moment we came through the doors. They had followed me to the convention center. My mother wanted to see for herself whether I was who Doug had described, or whether this was, as she had quietly decided, another instance of Maeve making things sound more significant than they were. I wasn't surprised. I nodded once. Good. They need to see this. The program opened. The MC introduced the evening's honorees. Hargreaves was scheduled to speak in his capacity as past deputy director of the agency, to present the Community Impact Award to the agency's current senior leadership team. He took the podium. Silver hair, dark suit, the practiced warmth of a man who had refined sincerity into something that required no actual sincerity to perform. He opened with the expected register: service, dedication, the particular courage required to show up for vulnerable children in this province. The room applauded on cue. I didn't clap, sat with both hands on the table, eyes on him. He felt it. I could see it in the way his gaze kept returning to my table and then moving off again. The way you move off a thing you don't want to confirm is there. Then his voice shifted into something more calculated, and I recognized the shift because I had been trained to recognize it. In this field, he said, adopting a tone of careful sorrow, we sometimes see practitioners who allow their own judgment to override the structures we have built to protect the children we serve. Individual heroism is a compelling story, but it is not a safe practice. Those of us with long careers in child protection know the difference between courage and recklessness, and we have a responsibility to be honest about that distinction. He looked directly at my table when he delivered the last sentence. He had just made the only mistake that mattered. A chair scraped across the marble floor. The sound cut through the polished quiet of the atrium with a precision that required no amplification. Doug stood up, 67 years old, retired chief superintendent. The kind of man who had spent 30 years being the person other people called when the room was beyond managing. He gripped the back of his chair for balance and stood up straight. I was there. 4 words. No microphone. His voice reached every corner of the atrium the way a voice reaches a room when the person speaking it has nothing left to perform. Every head turned. Hargreaves's composure faltered for exactly 1 second before he recovered. Doug, this isn't the appropriate. You've spoken enough. Doug didn't raise his voice. He loaded it, which is an entirely different thing. He pointed at me, arm extended, hands steady. This woman entered a compromised structure on Gerrard Street East because 2 children were inside and the stairwell was closing. The structural failure occurred after they were clear. I have your agency's own internal summary, and I have read every word of it. The murmur that moved through the room was not quiet. It was the sound of 200 people recalibrating. Hargreaves's knuckles went white on the podium. He was trying to hold the situation, and the situation had already left. The first person stood up without any coordination from anyone. A woman in her 40s, near the back, wearing a lanyard that said Scarborough Family Services. Her voice shook slightly, but it carried. I was the intake coordinator who received the children that night. 2 children, both in stable condition, both coherent, both asking when they could see their father. I wrote in my intake notes that the practitioner who brought them in had likely prevented a very different outcome. She paused. That note was removed from the case summary before the review. A man in his 50s stood up in the middle section. He was wearing the kind of suit that belonged to someone from legal. I was the independent reviewer on the structural assessment. My report concluded the collapse occurred within 6 minutes of the evacuation. I submitted that timeline to the review board. I was informed my finding was outside the scope of the review's parameters. He looked at Hargreaves. That's the first time I've said that out loud in 4 years. And then, from a seat near the side aisle, a man I hadn't seen since he was being discharged from a pediatric ward 4 years ago. Lucas's father. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a flannel shirt, and he was holding his hat in both hands, and his voice broke twice and he didn't stop speaking. She came up the stairs when no one else would. My son was 4 years old. My son still talks about the lady with the rabbit. He stopped, drew a breath. He doesn't know her name. I looked for 2 years. Doug found her. He turned and looked at me and said, "Thank you. I don't know what else to say. Thank you." Hargreaves had stepped back from the podium. There was nothing on the teleprompter that could manage this. No communication strategy for a room that was deciding on its own what the record said. Constance rose from the front row, unhurried. The deliberate movement of a woman who had spent 30 years understanding exactly how these rooms worked and had waited 4 years for this one. The internal review summary was marked confidential at the agency's request, she said. Her voice didn't require a microphone either. It has been shared with the College of Social Workers of Ontario, the Ministry, and David Chen at the Toronto Star, whose full account will run in Sunday's edition. She turned to the room. The record has been corrected. No way back. Not for any of them. The woman from Scarborough Family Services raised her hand to her forehead in a slow, deliberate gesture. Not military. Just acknowledgement. The kind that only exists when someone has nothing left to perform and is down to the truth. Lucas's father did the same, then Doug. And then, one by one, without coordination, without instruction, without anyone asking them to, the room rose. Not applause. No one clapped. Just people standing up in silence, the way you stand for something that has waited long enough to be stood for. I stood, raised my hand in return. From the edge of my vision, at the east entrance of the atrium, I saw my mother. She had one hand pressed flat against the wall beside her, the way you hold a wall when the floor has moved. She wasn't crying yet. She was doing something harder than crying. She was watching a room full of strangers confirm that the daughter she had spent 41 years calibrating downward had been, the entire time, exactly who she'd claimed to be. Kira stood behind her, and for the first time since I could remember, she had no expression prepared for the occasion. Her face was just her face. Nothing performed, nothing managing anything. The sentence had been delivered. No one needed to speak it. 3 days later, 9 in the morning, 2 knocks at my apartment door, soft and uncertain, the sound of knuckles that weren't sure of their welcome. I checked the peephole. My mother stood on the landing, no jewelry, no reading glasses pushed up on her head, no book club armor, plain clothes, hair pulled back simply, the way she looked in old photographs from before she had decided who she was going to be in the world. She was holding a tin. The butter tarts. The same tin she brought to Kira's every December. The first time in 41 years she had brought them to my door. I stood on the inside, hand on the deadbolt. No hurry, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Then I opened the door, didn't step back, didn't make space, just stood in the frame. Maeve. Her voice broke on the first syllable. I'm sorry, I didn't know. I looked at my mother, not angry, not satisfied. Still as a January morning on Lake Ontario. You didn't know, I said, or you chose not to ask. Those are 2 different things. You had my number for 4 years. Every transfer, every move, I made sure you had it. You chose not to dial. She tried to speak. You'd rather trust a byline in an agency press release than call the daughter you raised. You heard my voice break on the phone, and your first instinct was to say, I told you so. I didn't raise my voice. You didn't need more information. You needed it to be the version you'd already decided on, she cried. Not the crying of someone who finally understands. The crying of someone drowning in the shame of having been witnessed. Give me a chance, she said. She reached for my arm. I stepped back 1 pace. Nothing dramatic. Practical. You don't need a chance to understand me, I said. You need a chance to feel better about yourself. Those aren't the same thing, and I'm not the one who can give you the second one. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it. Later I'd see it was Kira. The text that followed said, You made Mum cry in the hallway of your building. Could you maybe be easier about this? Not 1 syllable of accountability. Not 1 question about what I'd carried for 15 years, or what I'd walked up those stairs into. Just, could you be less inconvenient? That was the last answer I needed. Go home, Mum, I said. Not anger. The voice of a person who had arrived at this decision across 15 years of quiet thought, not in the heat of one evening. Don't come back until you're coming because you want to not because you want to feel better. I'll know the difference. I closed the door, the deadbolt turned once clean and final, the shortest, most decisive sound in this entire story. That same week, Hargreaves asked to meet. A coffee shop on King Street, his suggestion, the kind of place that runs on ambient noise and anonymity. No agency communications officer in the car outside. No deputy minister with a public statement ready. Just a 63-year-old man at a small table with a flat white going cold in front of him, waiting for the woman he had spent 4 years allowing to be misrepresented. I sat across from him. The silence between us was louder than anything that had been said in that atrium. He admitted everything. The decision to mark the internal summary confidential. The instruction to the communications team. The years of allowing the review reprimand to stand in my file while the documented outcome, 2 children evacuated before a structural failure, was buried in a folder nobody was authorized to open. He laid it all out the way a man empties his pockets when he knows what comes next. Mechanically. Without particular pride. Because the alternative was carrying it, and he could feel the weight of it finally becoming something his back couldn't manage. When he finished, he asked the only question he had left. Why didn't you fight it sooner? I looked at him across the table. Because bitterness is weight I couldn't afford to carry, I said. I used those 4 years to get better at the work. Every family I sat with, every door I knocked on, every kid I helped stabilize, that all happened because I refused to let your decision become the story of my career. I let him sit with that for a moment. My record exists regardless of what your file said. The work happened. You can't unmark that. I paused. But you'll know what you buried. Every time someone in this field is recognized for something, every time you sit in a room like that atrium, you'll know. There's no appeals process for that. I put money on the table for my coffee and stood up and walked out into the December light on King Street without looking back. 1 week later, Doug called, not about Hargreaves. Not about the Star article, which had run on Sunday and which I had read once quietly in my kitchen and then set aside. Just a quiet voice on the line, the voice of a man who had known me since I was 11. There's a group I go to on Thursday evenings, Burlington, coffee and plastic chairs. People who've been through reviews, through the machinery, social workers, a few officers, some nurses, not a therapy group, just people who need somewhere to set down the things they've been carrying while they figure out what to do with them. You want to come? I drove out in civilian clothes. No lanyard, no commendation pin, just myself. The room was in the basement of a community center on Brant Street, 12 chairs in a loose circle, a coffee maker that had seen better days, a box of President's Choice cookies on a folding table. The particular atmosphere of a room where nobody needs you to be anything in particular. I took the chair with its back to the wall and a clear sight line to the door. The habit I'd carry for the rest of my career probably. I hadn't planned to speak. I came because Doug asked, and that was enough. When the facilitator opened the floor and turned to me, I looked around the circle. My gaze stopped at a young woman in her late 20s across from me, folded forward in her chair, eyes on the linoleum, shoulders curved inward in the particular posture of someone who has been carrying something alone for long enough that they've started to mistake the weight for their own shape. I recognized her immediately, not her face, her posture. She was exactly where I had been in the months after Ridgecrest. I stood up. The hardest part, I said, voice slow and quiet, not the practitioner voice, just my voice, isn't what happens in the building. The hardest part is what you do with it afterward. When you come home and nobody can see what you walked into. When the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who understand it least. I paused. I know how to carry the work. What took me 15 years to learn was that I was also allowed to put it down. The young woman looked up. Her eyes were wet, and she didn't try to do anything about it. They said you went into a building that wasn't safe, she said. Her voice thin and careful like something she was testing the weight of. That you did it anyway. I looked at her. I went in because 2 kids were inside and the way out was closing. I paused. That's not a dramatic thing, that's just the math. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, slow. Around the circle, the others nodded too. The nod of people who recognized something they've been carrying alone and hadn't known had a name. I sat back down, reached for a cookie from the President's Choice box and ate it without apology. Doug, from 2 chairs down, caught my eye, said nothing. Just the small nod of a man who has been waiting for someone to find their way back to themselves and is content to have been part of how they got there. Driving home on the QEW, Burlington skyline giving way to Mississauga, then Toronto, the lake black and wide to my left, I rolled the window down even though it was December and let the cold come in. No radio. Just the road and the engine and the particular quiet of a person who has stopped expecting the volume of what they carry to match the noise people make when they finally see it. I thought about my mother. Sitting right now in the Oakville house, where the photographs on the wall had always had Kira at the center, and me at the edge of the frame, not by choice, but in the space left after everyone else had already arranged themselves around the people they'd decided mattered. I wondered if she'd moved any of those photographs. I decided it didn't matter. I thought about Hargreaves drinking his flat white on King Street, sitting now somewhere in this city with a record he couldn't amend, and a room full of people who had stood up in silence for something he had spent 4 years trying to keep seated. I thought about Kira drafting another text somewhere, still finding the angle that would make this about my difficulty rather than her choices. She would find one. She always did. All of them locked inside their own accounting. The accounting of a woman who decided decades ago which of her children had a ceiling and had never thought to check whether she'd been right. The accounting of a man who confused seniority with correctness long enough to bury the document that proved he was wrong. The accounting of a sister who had spent 40 years watching someone bleed and had only ever asked that the bleeding be quieter, but not me. I had walked into every version of what they'd handed me. The stairwell, the review, the phone call that ended with an "I told you so" and a dial tone. The years of standing at the edge of photographs, the laughter of 14 people in a kitchen in Oakville who shared my blood and had never once had my back. And I had carried myself through, not because anyone rescued me, because I made the decision every single day that the work mattered and therefore so did I. The quiet in the car was not loneliness. It was the silence of someone who had finally, after all the distance and the wait and the years of being placed at the edges of rooms where she should have been at the center, made it home, not to a house, not to a family that had earned the word, home to herself. Ridgecrest, at last, was at rest. And if this story found something in you, something you've been carrying that nobody in your own kitchen has thought to ask about, leave it in the comments. I want to read what you've held onto, because the record doesn't disappear just because nobody's filed it yet. It's there. It has always been there. And sometimes all it needs is someone to say, "I was there. I kept the clipping. I recognized the way you hold your shoulders." That's enough. That has always been enough.